The crowd froze as Vokar, the Empire's ultimate weapon, fell, and a lone human stood victorious. But just as Nathaniel turned to rally the oppressed, his closest ally stabbed him in the back. What happened next would shake the galaxy to its core. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The air inside the arena was electric, charged with bloodlust, hunger, and the pulsating rhythm of alien drums echoing through the curved steel walls. 1,000 eyes watched from tiered balconies, glowing with every color imaginable, their shapes as diverse as the galaxies they hailed from. Some buzzed, others hissed. A few chittered in anticipation. All were here for the same reason: to watch creatures bleed. In the center of this coliseum of brutality stood Nathaniel Gray, bare-chested, bruised, and unbowed. His figure, lean and scarred, was caked with the dust of past battles. He wasn't the largest warrior. He didn't have bioluminescent skin or venomous appendages like his competitors. What he had was something the Zorathians, the overlords of this place, could neither see nor measure. He had resolve, and a memory sharpened by injustice. Captured during an off-world reconnaissance mission, Nathaniel had been sold like cattle, paraded, shackled, beaten into compliance and thrown into the pits. The Zorathians believed humans were nothing more than upright animals, fragile, emotional, naive. They didn't care to understand the human mind. They didn't believe that grief, when cornered, could become a weapon more devastating than claws or fangs. Nathaniel remembered everything. The moment his ship was ambushed, the cries of his crewmates as they were torn from their bunks, the cold laughter of the auctioneers who poked at his ribs like he was a slab of meat. That memory, bitter and permanent, had rooted itself deep within him. Every fight since then had been fueled by it. Every dodge, every strike, every breath drawn in defiance of the crowd's jeering had been part of a plan he never dared speak aloud. Stay alive long enough to understand the system, and then dismantle it from within. The arena announcer, some worm-like thing suspended in a glass bubble, screeched his name across the soundscape, its voice laced with mocking theatrics. The crowd roared in delight, not because they respected him, but because they were eager to see the clever monkey die. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He met their stares. He knew this wasn't just about brute strength. The arena was a test of control, of spirit, and his spirit had never been theirs to break. He tightened his grip on the twin steel blades they'd given him, standard issue for their human fighters, duller than the weapons reserved for alien champions. No matter. A sharper blade wouldn't make his strike truer. He didn't need mercy. He needed opportunity. And when it came, he would be ready, high above the blood-soaked sands of the arena, in a levitating obsidian dais encased in translucent energy. The Zorathians watched. Their forms were monolithic. 8-foot titans carved from midnight scales and plated with living armor that pulsed with bioelectric veins. Their eyes, vertical slits glowing with ultraviolet fire, surveyed the carnage below without emotion. Their language was a series of bone-deep vibrations, too complex for humans to mimic, too ancient to be anything but a declaration of dominion. The Zorathians were not born of empathy or nuance. They were bred from conquest. Entire solar systems bent to their will, their empires stitched together by war and sustained through fear. For them, the gladiatorial games weren't cruelty. They were legacy, a living demonstration that their species reigned supreme across all known stars. Every arena, every death was proof that weakness was a disease, and they were the cure. Humans, in particular, amused them. So soft, so sentimental. Their culture dripped with irrational ideals like mercy, equality, love. The Zarathians dissected human literature and broadcast it in the Empire's educational channels as a warning. This is what happens when emotion outweighs reason. To them, Earth's downfall was inevitable and deliciously ironic. So when Nathaniel Gray, a lone human with no formal combat enhancements and no genetically engineered muscle structure, began to win, they were more confused than threatened. At first, they labeled his victories as statistical anomalies. Perhaps his enemies were poorly matched. Perhaps the terrain favored him, perhaps luck. But when he dismantled a four-armed Greylock brute with nothing but twin arena knives, they leaned forward. When he used strategy, tripping a 10-foot Farn warrior into its own blade, they narrowed their eyes. And when he began to pace his wins, controlling the tempo of each fight like a conductor leading an orchestra, they began to murmur. Not aloud, of course. Zarathians did not speak in doubt. But in the private data chambers of the overseers, simulations ran. New probability trees were generated. Files were opened on human neuroplasticity, limb-to-mass ratios, cortisol-adrenal response. Nathaniel Gray was entered into the Zarathian Hall of Observation, not as a threat, not yet, but as a curiosity too consistent to ignore. That curiosity gnawed at them, because if a human could dominate the arena, then what else might they be capable of? And if even one human could rise above their station, perhaps the Zarathian Empire wasn't quite as invincible as it claimed. Across the spiral arms of the Zarathian Empire, whispers turned into broadcasts. On every world where the Gladiator games were syndicated, Nathaniel Gray's name became a murmured curiosity, then a controversial discussion, and finally a cultural disturbance. He was the anomaly the Empire couldn't statistically justify, a human whose existence in the arena was supposed to be fleeting, but had instead become legend. To the common citizen, it was spectacle. To the Zarathian elite, it was heresy. The arena was never intended to crown champions from the slave races. It was designed to reaffirm hierarchy, to feed the Empire's appetite for violence while reinforcing its myth of racial supremacy. Every creature that bled on the sand reaffirmed the Zarathian order. But Nathaniel bled and did not fall. He bled and learned. He bled and adapted. In the war chambers of the arena directors, the tone of discussion shifted. What began as dismissive amusement evolved into strategic anxiety. The algorithmic matchmakers were instructed to pair Nathaniel with aberrations, beasts bred without fear centers, competitors enhanced with neurotoxins, warriors conditioned to kill from birth. He was thrown into matches where odds were not tilted but collapsed entirely. And still, he returned, not unchanged. His body bore the record, fractures that healed crooked, burns etched into muscle memory, a limp earned from a tetrapod ambush that he never fully shook. But those injuries didn't slow him. They recalibrated him. They taught him where pain ended and adaptation began. Each opponent became a study in anatomy, tactics, and psychology. Nathaniel began to exploit behavioral tics, pre-fight rituals, even linguistic cues in their roars and battle cries. His strategies weren't just effective, they were humiliating. He didn't just win, he exposed his opponents, stripping away the illusion of their invincibility. And in doing so, he exposed the Zarathian lie. The Empire had sold the myth that strength was bred, that power came from bloodlines and biology. But Nathaniel was a living contradiction. His strength had been forged, not inherited. His victories weren't born of advantage. They were born of pain, defiance, and an intellect honed in captivity. What enraged the Zarathians most wasn't that he survived. It was that he made their champions look fragile. And every time he stood over a vanquished foe, he wasn't just a gladiator. He was a question mark, punctuating the end of an era where their superiority went unchallenged. Nathaniel fought for more than life now. He fought to expose the truth, that chains, no matter how ancient or gilded, could be broken, and that even in a pit designed to humiliate, a human could rise. The name Vokar had weight in the Zarathian Empire, a name that stopped conversation mid-sentence, that silenced even the boldest drunkards in the outer colonies. Vokar was not a gladiator. He was a living cataclysm, engineered in the brutal labs of Krell Tar, where genetics were rewritten not for beauty or intellect, but for carnage. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, his body was a latticework of plated muscle and retractable armor. His 4 arms moved with coordinated malice, each strike a study in anatomical precision. He didn't fight for entertainment. He fought because destruction was his only language. The Zarathians had withheld him from the arena for years, keeping him as a deterrent, a myth, a lurking threat to any slave who dared rise too high. But Nathaniel had climbed beyond what the Empire could stomach. He had become a symbol, not just to humans, but to all the enslaved. To creatures bred in darkness, Nathaniel was proof that suffering could be weaponized, that rebellion could wear a face. Vokar was meant to end that. The arena floor trembled under the creature's weight as the gates split open with a low groan of ancient metal. Nathaniel, standing alone, did not flinch. His muscles ached from the last bout, his ribs still sore where a taloned brute had landed a lucky blow, but pain had become part of his preparation. It kept his mind sharp, focused. The bell rang, and Vokar exploded forward. No ceremony, no stance, just a storm of violence. The first clash was deafening. Nathaniel barely dodged a swing that cracked the arena stone, fragments slicing his forearm. He backpedaled, heart pounding. The creature was faster than anything he had faced, stronger, more methodical. But Nathaniel noticed something. Vokar's attacks came with a rhythm, like a drumbeat. Savage, but timed. Predictable. And so he endured, he baited, he played the part of prey, letting the monster believe the narrative it had always been fed, that anything smaller must eventually fall. But Nathaniel was mapping every move, noting every overextension, every turn of the foot that exposed the unarmored tendon just beneath the knee joint. He circled debris, used broken pillars as cover, redirected Vokar's momentum into walls, into jagged rebar, into pain. It wasn't strength that would win him this fight. It was leverage. And when the final moment came, when Vokar's own rage sent him barreling toward Nathaniel in a blind charge, the human sidestepped, angled a shattered column just right, and let physics speak. The Colossus fell, hard and final, the ground shaking with its defeat. For the first time, the arena didn't erupt with cheers. It held its breath. Nathaniel stood over the wreckage, not triumphant, but still breathing, and that alone was rebellion. For a moment, the arena, usually a cacophony of roars, cheers, and the guttural cries of triumph, fell into absolute silence. It was not the silence of boredom or confusion. It was the stunned, breathless silence of something sacred being broken. Vokar, the undefeated behemoth, lay motionless in the dust, his enormous chest barely rising. And standing over him, breathing heavily but upright, was a man, flesh and blood, bruised and scarred, but unshattered. Nathaniel Gray didn't raise his fists. He didn't scream or gloat. He simply stood there, eyes scanning the walls of the arena, meeting the gazes of those who had once watched him like an insect. His silence was louder than any battle cry. It was a declaration. The myth was dead. High in their crystalline observatories, the Zarathians remained motionless. Their neural nodes flickered erratically as disbelief pulsed through the Empire's shared data streams. They had crafted this world with precision, a society defined by tiered genetics, rigid dominance, and immutable control. And now that foundation had cracked beneath the boot of a human, not through sheer strength, through cunning, through adaptation, through something they had long dismissed as weakness: resilience. Vokar's defeat was not merely a failed match. It was a philosophical collapse. The Empire's belief in predetermined superiority had sustained millennia of subjugation. But what could justify their rule if a human, a creature bred outside their hierarchy, born without modification, could unravel their finest predator with nothing but intellect and grit? The crowd began to stir, not with the bloodthirsty chant of before, but with something unfamiliar: respect, reverence. Cheers, hesitant at first, rose from the lower ranks, aliens of subjugated species who had watched the games not as fans but as reminders of their place. Now they watched Nathaniel as a mirror. If he could rise, maybe they could too. Nathaniel knew what this meant. His victory had tipped the balance. The arena, once a theater of fear, had become a stage for change. He hadn't just survived Vokar, he had dismantled the Empire's illusion, not with banners or revolts, but with undeniable proof that a human mind, sharpened by captivity and anchored by unbreakable purpose, could bring giants to their knees. The Zarathians didn't speak, but their silence screamed of something new. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. For the first time they realized that the spark they had tried to contain had become a fire, and it was spreading. The air still trembled with the echoes of Nathaniel's victory when the betrayal struck. Swift, silent, and surgical. He had barely turned to face the gathering crowd, intent on seizing the moment, when the blow came. A sharp crack against the back of his knee sent him staggering, blood splattering across the arena floor as a slender, curved blade hissed across his side. The crowd gasped, not in awe this time, but in confusion. Jorkan stood behind him, weapon drawn, his breathing shallow, his three-fingered hand trembling. His pale blue skin, once marked with the tribal scars of a conquered people, was now illuminated under the arena lights with shame. Nathaniel didn't collapse, but the wound was deep enough to stagger him. He turned slowly, pain written across his brow, but not from the blade. "Why?" Nathaniel asked, voice raw, not with anger, but betrayal's sting. Jorkan had fought beside him through a dozen battles. He had shared food in the slave quarters, whispered warnings of ambushes, even buried another fallen fighter with Nathaniel's own hands. His silence had once meant trust. Now it meant treason. "I had no choice," Jorkan rasped, eyes not meeting his. They promised me safe passage. My kin, my hatchmates, are still in the breeding pens. The Zarathians said they'd release them if I helped them stop you before you lit the match. Nathaniel stared at him, his expression caught between fury and sorrow. He understood what desperation could make someone do, but understanding didn't make the blade in his side hurt less, or the wound in his trust any easier to close. Jorkan stepped back, lowering the weapon, as if struck by his own cowardice. "You don't get it," he whispered. "Rebellion doesn't end well. You rise, they burn entire planets. You speak, they silence bloodlines. You think you're winning, but you're not. You're just next." Nathaniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. His body did. With a slow, purposeful motion, he pressed his palm against the wound, stopped the bleeding with a makeshift wrap from his sash, and stood tall. No longer just a man, but the embodiment of defiance. Jorkan looked at him one last time, then dropped the weapon and fled into the lower gates, his betrayal complete, his soul fractured. Nathaniel didn't chase him. He had seen betrayal before. But this one was different. It came from within, from someone he had believed in. And yet, rather than harden into hatred, it crystallized into something else: clarity. He could not rely on fractured alliances or promises born of fear. If this fight was to mean anything, it had to burn away everything false and leave only conviction, the kind that could withstand pain, the kind that didn't flinch when trust shattered. Because now, more than ever, Nathaniel understood. Survival was no longer enough. He had to change everything, or die trying. The gates groaned open with a sound that echoed like thunder through the Colosseum's cavernous heart. From the darkness emerged monsters, not warriors. These were not thinking beings, but engineered nightmares. Chimeric beasts with fused exoskeletons, serrated limbs, and sensory nodes that pulsed like exposed nerves. They didn't walk. They stalked, their movements precise and predatory, honed for one purpose: slaughter. Nathaniel stood alone, shoulders squared, body slick with blood. Some of it his own, some not. There was no armor on him now, no allies behind him. The betrayal still burned in his ribs, and yet he faced the oncoming flood with a quiet resolve that froze even the most cynical observers in their seats. He wasn't just a man anymore. He had become something elemental, unyielding, unsilenced, unbroken. This wasn't a fight, it was a reckoning. The first creature lunged, its claw arcing like a guillotine. Nathaniel sidestepped just enough to feel the wind shear past his throat and drove his blade upward into the creature's undercarriage, piercing soft tissue beneath its plated belly. A shriek tore through the air as the beast collapsed in spasms. Another replaced it instantly, snarling, mandibles clicking with hunger. Nathaniel pivoted, using its momentum against it, hurling the creature into a wall of jagged debris left over from Vokar's fall. And still they came, 6, 10, 12. He moved like a man dancing on the edge of annihilation. Each motion was deliberate. No energy wasted, no strike without purpose. His body, battered and bleeding, moved not with desperation but with rhythm, like a soldier long past fear. Every drop of blood was a promise kept. Every breath drawn was another insult hurled at his captors. Up in the royal box, the Zorathians watched without speaking. Their holographic lenses zoomed and tracked and recorded, but no data could explain what they saw. Nathaniel was exceeding every limit of human physiology. He should have collapsed long ago. And yet he endured, not through mutation or technology, but through will. Below, the crowd began to shift. First murmurs, then chants. Even non-humanoid throats roared in unison, drawn to the spectacle of something real, something that could not be scripted or engineered. Nathaniel's defiance had become contagious. It was no longer a human rebellion. It was a fracture in the Zorathian illusion. He didn't pause, didn't bask. His eyes remained focused, tracking the next threat. He knew the moment demanded more than survival. It demanded sacrifice, fury, and something the Empire had never accounted for: hope forged through pain. One man, one stand, and a galaxy watching. The sand was slick with blood and scorched with the residue of energy blasts, claw strikes, and shattered bone. Smoke coiled in the air above the arena, dimming the once blazing lights that had so proudly illuminated Zorathian supremacy. Now, those same lights flickered uncertainly, casting long shadows across a battlefield where something unthinkable had just taken place. Nathaniel Gray stood at its center. His body trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion born of defiance. Gashes lined his arms, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his right leg bore the weight of a dozen fractures, hastily splinted mid-battle with alien armor shards. And yet he stood, upright, unyielding. Around him, the last of the engineered beasts lay silent. Dead. the final threat crushed by human will. For a long moment there was no sound, no anthem, no declaration, only the sharp, living silence of a regime that had lost control. In the balconies above, the Zarathian overlords watched with their mouths sealed, their grand cloaks of synthetic silk hanging like funeral banners. Their empire had thrived on spectacle, on the belief that dominance was destiny, but destiny had failed them. The gladiator they had paraded, mocked, and pit against nightmares had not only survived, he had turned their own games against them, not with brute conquest but with endurance, clarity, and sheer irrepressible rage. The crowd began to move, not out of panic but reverence. Thousands of spectators, from dozens of enslaved species, slowly stood, not to flee but to bear witness. Nathaniel didn't raise his fists, he didn't speak, he didn't need to. The sight of him, standing, bloodied, victorious, was more powerful than any rallying cry. In that instant, the illusion cracked. The Zarathians were not gods, not invincible, and humans were not weak. The ripple began there in the Colosseum's smoking basin, but it would not end there. Word of the battle would travel faster than light, carried through black markets, rebel frequencies, and whispered stories between cell bars. On prison worlds and mining colonies, the name Nathaniel Gray would become a spark in the dark, a myth made flesh. And on Earth, forgotten, underestimated, written off, his triumph would be the first chapter of a new history, one written not in submission, but in fire and resolve. Because Nathaniel had done more than win. He had shown the universe what one soul, burning with purpose, could do when pushed to the edge. And the universe would never be the same again.